Okay, fine. Hi. There's a when we talk about good and evil, right and wrong, there's an important double application that those ideas have. Actions can be right or wrong, good or bad, and people can be good or bad. And they don't line up. A good person with good motivation can do something that's bad, and a bad person with bad motivation can do something that's good. I'll give you examples. Peter is sinking in the river. He's drowning. And George jumps into the river, and at some danger to himself, pulls Peter out, and then rolls him over and takes his wallet out of his back pocket and runs. All George wants is the money. Well, if a person's drowning in a river, it's kind of hard to get the money. He saved Paul's life. That's definitely good. But he, as a person, George, is a bad person with bad motivation. And similarly, it's January 3rd in Chicago, and it's sleeting, and there's a car pulled over by the side of the road, and George pulls over and says, "You have a problem?" He says, "Yeah, I don't know, the car just stopped and it's not working." He says, "Well, open the hood." He opens up the hood, and George happens to know something about cars. And he rearranges the materials under the hood. He closes the hood and says, "Start her up." And the driver does whatever you do today to start it up. And there's a boom, and smoke pours out of the engine. There's a meltdown. Well, George is a good guy. I mean, he's standing there in the sleet trying to help someone who's stranded. It's just that he ruined the motor. So when we talk about good and evil, right and wrong, we have to take into account the fact that there are good and evil, right and wrong actions, and there are good and evil people. And the question is, what does God judge when he judges? We're doing tshuva for failures. The failure has a location in the action that we do, and the failure has a location in our motivation and our character, usually. So you'll see now from the Rambam that the answer is not either or, but it's both in a very nuanced and subtle way. This is the beginning of chapter 3 of the Laws of Tshuva. Each and every person has merits and sins. No one's record is completely one-dimensional. A person whose merits exceed his sins is termed righteous. The word in Hebrew is tzaddik. So it goes into the majority. Now I should tell you the word tzaddik has at least 5 definitions for different contexts, and you will find many uses of the word that don't agree with this definition. Not because there's a disagreement, it's just that the same word has different definitions in different contexts. Here, the Rambam is telling us that this is the one he wants to talk about. A person who sins, exceed his merits, is termed wicked. If his sins and merits are equal, he's termed Beinoni, which means an intermediate position. We spoke about this yesterday, so what happens in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Same applies to an entire country. If the merits of all its inhabitants exceed their sins, it's termed righteous. Their sins are greater, it's termed wicked. Now let's be careful here, because there are 2 ways in which you might have thought to understand it, and the Rambam's words are clear which way he intends. let's imagine you have 10 people altogether. And let's suppose that the scale of achievement is from 0 to 100. And 6 of them have more merits than sins, and 4 have more sins than merits. That's not what the Rambam's talking about. That would be the majority of the people are righteous. That's not what the Rambam says. The Rambam says the majority of their actions are merits. So here's an example of what that could possibly mean. Let's suppose, again, that we have 10 people. Let's imagine that 6 of them, on a scale of 0 to 100, have 51 sins and 49 merits. So each of them is termed wicked. But let's suppose the other 4 each have 80 merits and 20 sins. So when you sum it up, the number of actions in the total population of 10, which are merits, is far greater than the number which are sins. Each of the 6 is only 2 down, and each of the 4 is 40 up, 30 up, 30 up. So when you talk about the number of actions, that totality will be considered to be righteous. Which means that one person's record can compensate for another person's record. We're not regarded here as individuals, each one having his own record, and then you sum up the individuals. No, it's regarded as a collectivity. So for example, you have cases where on the whole there are a lot of bad people, but there are a few extremely righteous people, and the fact that they are so righteous outweighs the number of failures of the lower people, so that the community as a whole can be saved by the great righteous people who are within it. You could have imagined doing it in another way. Here, the idea of a group of people forming a collective is very powerful. Unlike contemporary Western political thought and sociological thought, that people are individuals, and if they form an association, it's only because each individual volunteers on his own to form the association, and he could disconnect himself whenever he pleases. Here, the idea is that there's a real multitude, and the multitude has a new identity on the basis of their joint performance. Just philosophically, that's what's going on. And the same applies to the entire world. If you sum up the actions of the entire world, then if the majority are merits, then the world is termed righteous, and if not, it's termed wicked. Now, the Rambam in the second paragraph says something which needs to be very carefully examined. If a person's sins exceed his merits, he will immediately die because of his wickedness. Quotes a passage from Jeremiah. Person's sins, he's just 1 short of 50. He has 50% minus 1 merits, and the rest are sins, he's gone. Golly, you look around the world and you read history, and it certainly doesn't seem like that. It seems like there are lots and lots of people who certainly qualify for the title of wicked, and they're doing fine. So what the Rambam writes here, in terms of what we see in the world, is very hard to understand. And he himself is going to address this when we get to the bottom. Now he says something else. Similarly, a country whose sins are great will immediately be obliterated, as is implied by the outcome of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and if the verse goes on, if they have done according to what I have heard, then destruction. So here too a question arises. let's take your 10 people, and let's reverse the characters. Let's say that 6 out of 10 have 51 merits, so they are righteous. And 4 out of 10 have 20 merits, 80 sins. So they're really bad. And if you take the sum total of the actions, the sum total of the actions is certainly bad. So according to what the Rambam writes here, then the group is going to be destroyed, even though there's 6 people there, each of whom is righteous. Because he has 51 merits, and the Rambam called such a person righteous. How is that fair to the 6 people? Why should that happen? There are 2 answers here. Here, and then in the next case there'll be one answer. But one answer here is this. The Rambam writes elsewhere that everyone is affected by his surroundings. No one is sealed off from his environment. And a person who finds himself in an evil environment should leave. He should leave. He shouldn't trust himself that he'll build a wall or he'll strengthen his psychology and he won't be affected. He should leave. So this pronouncement on the country isn't a death warrant on otherwise righteous and blameless people, because when the person sees that the majority of the actions of the group has sunk so low, he has a responsibility to leave. And if he doesn't leave, then he has invited the fate of the group to apply to himself as well. So this person is not blameless. But then the Rambam goes on to say that the same thing is true with respect to the world as a whole. So the entire world as well, were its sins to be greater than their merits, they would be immediately destroyed. Okay, now let's go back to the same question. The majority of the actions is bad, but there are people, the majority of each whose actions is good. It's just outweighed by the tremendous evil of the wicked. Why should they be destroyed together with the whole of the world? Now, here, theoretically, the Rabbi actually says this, theoretically, it's possible to detach yourself from the world as a whole. That doesn't mean you have to float in space. It means detach yourself from the social world. Rambam says, go to a desert and live all by yourself in the desert. And then, when it speaks of the world being destroyed, it won't include this person. If you imagine that there's a population, let's say, of 1 million people, and 16 of them, each individually, take refuge in 16 different places, so when the rest are destroyed, they don't have a world. The world as a world is destroyed. All the institutions are destroyed, all the resources are destroyed, all the possessions are destroyed. These people will continue to live, but as a world, there's nothing that can be called a world left. But even more than that, Maimonides here quotes a verse where when he speaks about the whole world being destroyed, he says, God saw the evil of man, that was great. God said, I will destroy man. Those words are spoken about the generation of the flood. And you remember very well, with the generation of the flood, 8 people were saved. Noah and his children and their wives were all saved. And it says, because I see that Noah is tzaddik before me in this generation. So general rules can have exceptions. When it says the whole world, there could be exceptions. And this is a lesson that you need to learn with respect to Torah literature entirely. Because general rules very often have exceptions. And this includes the literature of the Tanakh, which is dictated by God, and some say parts are inspired by God, and it includes the oral tradition as well. Rabbi Yochanan, a great Talmudic sage, said, Ein lamedim min haklalos. We don't learn from general statements. By which he meant, you can have a general statement, all A's are B's, but you should expect to find some A's that aren't B's. Because it's not meant to be exhaustive. Not meant to be absolutely universal. And then Rabbi Yochanan goes on to say even more, goes on to say, what this? Okay. Rabbi Yochanan goes on to say that even if the statement explicitly mentions exceptions, so the statement you have on record is all A's are B's except for P, Q, and R. And you think, well, look, whoever made that statement, he himself said P, Q, and R are exceptions. So surely, when he said that, he meant to tell you that those are the only exceptions. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, that's not true either. He said all A's are B's except P, Q, and R. It could be X, Y, and Z are also exceptions. We don't take universal sounding statements as precisely universal. Now, you have to understand here that this is not an accident, and it's not sloppiness, and it's not inexact thinking. You're dealing with a literature, and literature is part of a culture, and you have to know how that culture expresses itself. And you are told that that culture expresses itself in ways where the words are universal words, but the content, the meaning of it is not strictly applying to every possible case. And you have this in the Torah, the written Torah itself. And as I have mentioned in other contexts, you should expect that the oral tradition imitates the style of the written Torah itself. I'll give you two examples. Moses at the burning bush. And one of the objections he raises against the mission that Hashem wants to send him on is, when I go and tell the Jewish people in Egypt that their God, the God of their fathers, and the creator of the universe appeared to me, they won't believe me. So Hashem says to Moses, what do you have in your hand? And he says, a staff. And he says, throw it on the ground. It becomes a snake. And Moses runs. And God says, grab the snake. And he grabs it. And it becomes a staff in his hand. And it says, so that they should believe you. And then it says, and a second one, he says, take your hand to put it in your garment. He pulls it out, and it's leprous. Put it back in. It isn't leprous. And God says the following words. If they don't believe the first sign, they'll believe the second sign. The next words are, and if they don't believe the second sign, and the reader says, hey, wait a second, wait a minute. You just said they will believe it, and now you say, if they don't? And the meaning is, when I said they will believe it, what I mean is, they should, they ought to, you could expect it, it would be normal, but not absolute. Not absolute. Same thing, we read a couple of weeks ago in the portion of the Torah, Sefer Dvarim. One verse says, Efes kiloi b'cha evyon. This idea of lending money to poor people and so forth and so on, there'll come a time when that won't be necessary, because there'll be a time where there won't be any poor people. And then the whole idea of lending to the poor won't apply. And a few verses distant from that, it says, the impoverished people will not be missing from the land. So one says there won't be impoverished people, and the other says there will be impoverished people. And the oral tradition says they're talking about different circumstances. If you arrive at a certain level in your service of the Kodesh Baruch Hu, then the circumstances will change and there won't be any poor people. And if not, not. So what sounded like an absolute statement was really subject to conditions which weren't stated. And this is a typical feature of the Torah. I'll give you one more example. Jacob is on his way out of the land of Israel, and he has the famous dream with the angels going up and down, and God speaks to him. And God makes certain promises to him. And one of the promises is you'll come back in peace to your father's house. I'll give you food, I'll protect you. On his way back, he hears that Esau is coming with 400 men who are not there to roll out the red carpet. They're there to attack him and to destroy him. And he pleads with God that he shouldn't be destroyed. So the commentator said, but God promised you that. So what do you mean pleading for him? Isn't it given to you? Isn't it guaranteed? And no, the oral tradition explains there's a possibility of Shema Yigrom Achet. It could be that if he has spiritual failures, then the promise won't be applied. The promise wasn't open-ended and unconditional. No, the promise had conditions built into it. It's just that the text didn't explain what the conditions were. So here, where the Rambam says the world will be destroyed, and the verse that he brings to prove it is a verse that describes the generation of the flood, we know that 8 people survived the flood. So it doesn't have to apply to each and every person. So that's the way in which you could handle the seeming unfairness of the righteous being dragged down by the wicked. But we didn't explain the existence of wicked people who don't die immediately, where the Rambam says. And now the Rambam is going to explain that with a very important and subtle idea. This reckoning, the idea of majority, the idea of most of your actions, is not calculated only on the basis of the number of merits and sins. It's not the number of actions, but also takes into account their magnitude. Each action has a certain size. It has a certain effect. It has a certain power, and they're not equal. There are some merits which outweigh many sins, as implied by verse of Melachim, because in him there was found a good quality, therefore I'm going to overlook the many bad things that he did. In contrast, a sin may outweigh many merits. As it says, one sin may obscure much good. So the sins and the merits aren't counted just but the translator is right. It's not, the number does count, but it's not only the number, it's also on the basis of their intrinsic size. What is that? And how do you measure that? Now is where the Rambam says something extremely, extremely crucial on page 5. The weighing of sins and merits is carried out in accordance to the wisdom of the knowing God. He knows how to measure merits against sins. Only Hashem can do this. Only Hashem can do this. Now the phrase that the Rambam uses here, which the translator renders the knowing God, Kael Deos, a God of Deos. What are Deos? Well, Deos comes from the word das, which is one of the many words that we have for knowledge or understanding. But another usage of the word Deos is to talk about character traits, the inner personality and character of the agent. As a matter of fact, the second section of the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam's legal work from which this is taken, is called Hilchos Deos, the laws of Deos, and it is the laws of perfecting your character, building virtue and patience and sympathy and courage and so forth and so on. Now that phrase, Kael Deos, is taken from a specific incident in the life of the prophetess Hannah, where she had no children. And her husband had another wife who had many children. And the second woman criticized and belittled Hannah on the grounds that if Hashem gave me children and give you children, there's something wrong with you. Children are a great blessing. And if God is withholding that blessing from you, then you must be failing in some spiritual way. It wasn't true. Not only wasn't it true, but we have famous records of people who didn't have children who weren't failing in any spiritual way at all. And you all know who they are. Abraham and Sarah didn't have children for decades. Isaac and Rebekah didn't have children for 20 years. Jacob had no children from Rachel, and the Torah says explicitly, Hashem altered the norm for the patriarchs and enabled Leah to have children right away because she was less favored in Jacob's eyes. Therefore, she was aided in her pain by having children. It means the norm for the patriarchs was not to have children. And indeed, when Sarah told Abraham to take Hagar to wife, and Hagar belittled Sarah when she became pregnant, it was the same mistake. The norm for the patriarchs is that their children should be supernatural, not natural. That's the norm. That's why they had to pray for it, and that's why they had to wait for it. So here too, in the case of Hannah, she is a Neviah, she's a prophetess. That's the highest spiritual level that any human being can achieve. So the other wife criticizing her and pulling her down was definitely inappropriate and undeserved. When Hannah has her child, who's Hannah's child? The prophet Shmuel. Then Hannah gives expression to her position in a shira, great shira. And one of the things she says concerning the other wife is, Kel Deos, the one who knows Deos, will know how to interpret and evaluate what she did. So there, Kel Deos doesn't mean philosophy. It means Hashem sees into the heart of the person and judges the action that the person did on the basis of the character of the person. And this is what I meant 20 minutes ago when we started, when I said there's judgment of agents and judgment of actions, and they're separate, and you could distinguish a good person could do a bad thing and a bad person could do a good thing. That's all true. But when the Kodesh Baruch Hu evaluates, he evaluates the action together with the character of the person who's doing the action. So it's a package. And that's what he means, what the Rambam means when he says one sin could outweigh many merits and one merit could outweigh many sins. So for example, take two people who put on tefillin. Depends upon what it takes for them to put on the tefillin. You have, let's say, you could even take my case of Baal Tshuva on the one hand, and the child of a Baal Tshuva. I got into Jewish practice when I was 19, 20, and I knew nothing. Not only did I know nothing about it, but I have been taught all sorts of lies about it. It was a great matter of self-readjustment to the ideas. And then you have to start performing something which you don't really understand. Understand the meaning for it, the basis of it, to understand the laws of it. Putting on tefillin, so I'm putting on tefillin. Okay, I'm doing it. But it's hard and it's not very inspiring. My children grew up, everybody puts on tefillin. And they studied the laws of tefillin before they put them on. And they studied the symbolism of tefillin. It's an entirely different thing. So my putting on tefillin and their putting on tefillin aren't equal. I had to struggle. I had to overcome resistance. I had to overcome the fact that I wasn't very motivated or inspired by it. They don't have that struggle. So my putting on tefillin is a bigger mitzvah in my life than their putting on tefillin is in their lives. For them it's just normal and natural. They wouldn't dream of going through a day without tefillin. It just wouldn't occur to them. So now, you take a look at a person and you have to ask, where did he come from? What are his inspirations and what are his stumbling blocks? What are his impulses to good and impulses to evil, both of which he has to deal with? And the text testifies that only Hashem can know that. Only Hashem can know that. And it testifies to this in an extremely dramatic way. Hashem says, Shmuel, go to Yishai. One of his sons is going to be king. Take along with you the shemen, the oil, to anoint him as king. Fine. Shmuel comes to Yishai. It says, gather together your sons. And he calls in all except Dovid, whom he has a reason to think couldn't be qualified. And Shmuel's a Navi. He's a prophet. He's compared in the psalm that we say Friday nights, he's compared to Moses and Aaron. He looks at Yishai's oldest son and he thinks, yes, that's the one. That's the one. Look at him. You can see in him nobility. You can see in him greatness. See in him strength. Hashem says to Shmuel, you're dead wrong. Steve, I'm disgusted with him. And then Hashem says to him these words, Ha'adam yir la'einayim, v'Hashem yir la'levav. Man looks with his eyes, and he sees the external, which is superficial. Hashem looks into the heart. And if he's saying this to Shmuel, and saying that he can't look into the heart, that seals it. None of us can do it either. So when every person acts, there's a hidden element. And that's the character behind the acting. And that being the case, we see only the external. We only see the action. We don't see the agent behind the action. Hashem, when he judges the totality of the action together with the agent. So our judgment just doesn't fit the total reality. Says the Rambam, when you see a person who it appears to you that he's wicked, that the majority of his performance is wicked, you're counting up individual actions. You're pretending that they're all equal in size. They aren't all equal in size. And only I know what the inner reality is. So, first of all, that means that when a person performs an action, and you take this into account for yourself, then sometimes factors which reduce your responsibility are real. They are real. And that being the case, it may not be as bad as you think it is. It may not be shouldn't condemn yourself so strongly. And I'll give you another dramatic example. Someone says to a Jew, bow to the idol. And notice he says, I'm holding a gun, and it's up to you. Either you bow to the idol or you die. Take your choice. Now, you're not supposed to bow to idols. Not only that, but if someone puts a gun to your head, it says bow to the idol, you're supposed to die rather than bow to the idol. That's the mitzvah, that's the commandment. Now let's imagine there are two witnesses standing there, and they say to the Jew, listen, we're watching you, we're warning you, idol worship is a capital crime, we're going to go to the court, we're going to give testimony against you, you better not do it. And the Jew says, I hear you, but I can't die. I just can't do that. No, I'm not doing that. And he bows to the idol. What happens now? When the witnesses come to the court, we saw Reuven bow to the idol. And by the way, the fact that a person's a gun to his head doesn't automatically mean he's lost his free will. Because as you know very well, history has had many people with guns to their heads who have said no and died. So it's not automatic that he lost his free will. I mean, he might have gone into shock, but let's take a case where he didn't go into shock. He made the wrong decision. The Rambam writes, as far as I know, no one disagrees, that he will not be punished. He will not be executed. He will not be beaten. The penalty for idol worship, of course, is being cut off from Hashem, will not apply to him. Why? Because it wasn't his idea, and he was at the threat of losing his life. Under those conditions, he's not punished at all. It's called onus. And the famous statement of Chazal is, onus rachmana patre, someone who is suffering from that kind of pressure, because Baruch Hu freed him from punishment. Now, there are lesser forms of onus. For example, the guy with the gun, this now has a blowtorch, and he says, bow to the idol, I'll burn down your house. Of course, he shouldn't bow to the idol. And this time, if he bows to the idol, he doesn't escape punishment, but it isn't as serious as if he chose to do it without a threat to lose his house. Anything that makes an action more difficult in terms of your motivation means that if you fail, you're less responsible. One example of this, which is, I think is very, very simple, very direct. You know what tzitzis are. Tzitzis are the strings you put on the end of your garments. And you know from the third paragraph of Shema that it's supposed to have white threads and blue threads. That's what the Torah says to do. But the Mishnah in Menachos says, you're supposed to do that. That's the best way to do it. But if your tzitzis are all white, it's okay. You've satisfied the mitzvah, not in the best way, but you satisfied it. And if they're all blue, you satisfied it. You should have had blue and white. So the question is raised, what's worse? To have tzitzis that are all blue, or to have tzitzis that are all white? Which is the worst failure? So first of all, the question implies not all failures are equal, which is exactly what the Rabbi is saying here. But second of all, how would you figure this out? What would the difference be? And the Gemara says that the failure of all blue is worse. Why is the failure of all blue worse? And the answer is this. The blue threads are expensive. So imagine the guy who has all white. He says, I have all white. Listen, the blue threads are expensive. And I know it would be better to do it with the blue threads, but it's expensive. It's a lot of money. I just can't bring myself to do the mitzvah the best possible way because of the monetary expense. So he's fighting against the pressure and losing the fight. What about the guy who has all blue? The white costs a nickel. The whites are plentiful. Walk 5 minutes to the market, spend a nickel and get a white and do it right. And he says, no, not for me. That's much worse. He doesn't even care to spend a nickel for 5 minutes to get the white. But then there's no resistance. And therefore his action is much worse. Rather than the person who doesn't want to spend money on the blue, where there's resistance. And he doesn't overcome the resistance. So in all these cases, the motivation that you have, the difficulty, especially in the overcoming, mitigates the size of the failure. And then, like the Rambam says, the actions that you perform don't have all the same size. I'll put this once more in a way that I hope will be also helpful. Let's go back to the one who has a gun to his head. The mitzvah of the Torah is die. Give up your life, don't bow to the idol. If he dies, he's a hero. He's a hero. Now let's say he doesn't die and he bows to the idol. What's his failure? He's failed to be a hero. Is that a big failing or a little failing? Failing to be a hero? That's a very little failing. On a scale of 0 to 100, hero is from 96 and up. And he got 94. Is that a big failing? Not really. Not really. He just failed to be the very best. You can still be very good. So that's the way you have to measure the size of the actions that you perform. And that size is something which, Rambam says, can change your perspective on what you see and could answer the question, I see lots of wicked people who are still around. You don't know that they may have done 6 good things that nobody knows about, and that may be tipping the scales. In fact, I have another minute. I'll tell you a story. The Baal Shem Tov, the Levi Yisrael Berdichev, someone had a reputation as terribly stingy, and when he died, nobody wanted to go to his funeral. So the Yitzchak went to his funeral. And people said to him, why? I'll tell you why. He said, he came before me for a din Torah, lost the din Torah, he lost the case, and that's why I'm coming to his funeral. Really? He lost the case? Yeah. A man said to his wife, I'm going off to the big world to make my fortune, and I've taken care of you. So-and-so, this rich man, has promised to support you. Go to him every Friday morning, and he'll give you money. He was lying. He disappears. So the wife goes to this rich man Friday morning. She says, I'm here because my husband told me that you promised to support me. The rich man got it right away, and he gave him, of course, here. So he supplied her for years. Finally, the husband came back, he's expecting when he walks in the door, his wife's going to throw a pot at him because he was lying. He comes in, wonderful, oh, you made the money, wonderful, wonderful to see you. And he thinks, what happened here? That's very strange. I didn't expect that accepted. He goes to the rich man, he says, what happened? He said, your wife came, I understood what happened, and I supported her. Wow, the husband said, you supported me. Supported her? Well, now I have money. Tell me how much it was, and I'll pay you back. And the rich man said, no, I don't want the money back. It was my mitzvah to support her. I don't want the money back. So they came before Rabbi Yitzchak. The husband wants to pay, and the rich man doesn't want to receive. And Rabbi Yitzchak said, the husband's right, he should pay for it, and the rich man, so he lost that judgment in front of me. This is one of the things this person did in private that nobody knew about, and that outweighed the fact that when people came in public to ask him for money, he didn't give money. Okay. Try to hold on to the number 5, so we'll get to that tomorrow.